In the 1985 sci-fi movie Back to the Future, the inventor character Doc Brown explains his decision to build a time machine using a DeLorean of all cars by saying, "The way I see it, if you're going to build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?" And style was one of the immediately apparent features of the sports car when the first one rolled off the production line today in history in 1981, even if performance, power, and reliability were not.
Yeah, it came with a price tag of $25,000, more than $80,000 in today's money, which would turn out to be a wildly optimistic bid from the company. The DMC DeLorean was the only car the DeLorean Motor Company ever brought to market, and it was only sold for 2 years. I mean, it just happens to have been lucky that those years happened to be 1981 to 1983 when it could come to the attention of the Back to the Future production team.
Yes, although there was obviously no flux capacitor on this original model. The reason that a DeLorean of all models made its way into the Back to the Future script at all was because John DeLorean, for there was a man whom the car was named after, was in the news when Bob Zale and Bob Zemeckis were writing the screenplay. And he was in the news because he was at the centre of a $24 million cocaine conspiracy. We'll get there later. But first, let's just explain who John DeLorean was. He built his reputation as the vice president of GM, the biggest car company in the world. He was earning $600,000 a year, and he'd kind of become a celebrity. He went to Hollywood and became friends with Johnny Carson and Sammy Davis Jr. He married a model 25 years younger than he. He built out his jaw with plastic surgery. All quite uncommon for the kind of person who leads car companies, but it's clear that he had ambition, this guy.
Yeah, he was very breathlessly covered by the 1970s press and was sort of regarded as having bucked the corporate establishment and then set off on his own. And for a while, people thought that he'd kind of got out of the car game altogether. But in 1977, he came back announcing that he was going into business producing his own sports car bearing his own name. And his estimate was that he could have the car ready by the very next year. But obviously it wasn't until, 4 years later that the very first car was produced.
Which is actually still a remarkably quick turnaround, though.
True.
His initial vision had to be dramatically scaled back, partly for budget and time constraints, but also because some of the features he wanted to bring to the DeLorean relied on untested tech that turned out to be unworkable. So after extensive re-engineering, the first DeLoreans went into production in late 1980 at a plant he had purchased outside Belfast. But it wasn't necessarily a bad car. It was kind of a side effect of this hype machine that DeLorean had created around himself and around his company that was what tripped him up in the end, because the public and the automotive press had been led to expect a cutting-edge sports car, and instead they got what reviewers found to be kind of like a decent family tourer.
Yeah, I mean, the look of the car, designed by legendary car designer Giorgetto Giugiaro, is the best thing about it. And that's because he was an incredible designer. He'd worked on the VW Golf, the Fiat Panda, and created for DeLorean, his mate, this idea of a two-seater sports car with a gullwing door, which is very romantic, very cool, highly impractical when you park next to a parking meter or in the narrow spaces of European parking lots, but aimed at the American luxury car market who wanted something distinct. But in a way, the look was all he had. The power underneath the bonnet wasn't really there. Kind of for good reasons, actually. Like, DeLorean was insistent on having a sustainable car. A car that would last 300,000 miles, which was built out of stainless steel, not just because it had that distinctive look, but because it was sustainable, and therefore didn't have a sports car engine, had a reliable engine that could put in the mileage. But that made it, in reality, a less sexy purchase than had been promised, and it was all about what he'd promised. He'd taken the prototype around and said, "Hey everyone, invest in my company," and people had invested on the basis of how it looked and his promises about what he could achieve. And he hadn't sold as many as he'd said that he'd had. He'd told the British government, who gave him a grant to base in Belfast, that he'd sold 30,000 cars. He hadn't. He'd had 30,000 expressions of interest, which is a very different thing.
Yeah, and a lot of the problems with those very first cars that came off the production line were directly caused by the fact that he'd had to scale back all of his ambitions, including total re-engineering of the car by Lotus founder Colin Chapman, resulted in this very, very tight production schedule. And so he sort of created this problem for himself.
Yeah, not least with promotional materials that referred to the DeLorean as the car of the future and a masterpiece of engineering and design. It soon became pretty clear that not only did the DeLorean not live up to the hype, and this actually also ended up affecting the production of Back to the Future. The screenwriter Bob Gale told Esquire it broke down a lot and little things on the car would break during a scene and we'd have to wait for the FX guys to repair it. But nonetheless, they remained committed to the idea of having it. They'd actually been offered $75,000 by Ford to make Doc Brown's time machine a Ford Mustang. To which Gale apparently responded, Doc Brown doesn't drive a Mustang.
And the thing to bear in mind is that the parts on this car were being built not by experienced car workers on a production line, but by people who had never built vehicles before. As you said, it was in Dunmurry in Belfast. And this was an area that, at the height of the Troubles, had the highest unemployment rate in the developed world. So finding workers wasn't difficult, but finding experienced car plant workers was. And DeLorean's ego was just like, that is no obstacle. We will educate people. But of course, people were working on cars for the first time and there were teething problems. The reason they were in Belfast is because he wanted government money to fund the thing. And the Irish government initially had considered investing in DeLorean and then checked out his promises about how many orders that he said he had, realised he didn't really have them and decided to U-turn on the project. At which point the Northern Irish government were like, aha, look, this is something that for some reason the Irish have dropped out of. Let's get in there, and didn't do the same due diligence.
The company faced very serious financial challenges due to this problem of low demand in conjunction with cost overruns, and unfavourable exchange rates also played into the problem, leading to cash flow issues for DeLorean himself. And despite estimating a break-even point of just 10,000 to 12,000 cars that he needed to sell, only around 6,000 cars were sold. And then DeLorean came up with this brilliant contingency plan on how he'd get himself out of his problems. And it's fair to say it wasn't the best thought out plan in the first place.
Yeah, at this point, the company was in very ugly shape, at $17 million in debt, sitting on a pile of unsold inventory. And this was despite publicity stunts like a promotion with American Express to sell 100 gold-plated DeLoreans, priced at $85,000. Only 2 were ever sold, one to a businessman who donated it to the National Automobile Museum in Reno, the other one to a Texas bank president, which feels so on brand when you're thinking, who's driving a gold-plated car? A Texas bank president. But nonetheless, these stunts didn't have the desired effect, and DeLorean was by this point desperate for a quick injection of funds. Enter a former neighbour, a cocaine trafficker turned FBI informant called James Timothy Hoffman, who claimed to his handlers, yes, quite, and he came forward to his FBI handlers with the astonishing claim that DeLorean had approached him about a drug smuggling gig.
I mean, what followed is a matter of a bit of debate, but at some point in 1982, DeLorean became the target of this FBI sting operation designed to arrest drug traffickers, and he was arrested in October 1982 and charged with conspiring to smuggle $24 million worth of cocaine to the US.
Because he's on tape agreeing to that.
But DeLorean's attorney was able to successfully demonstrate to the court that he was coerced into participation in the deal. Basically, it was entrapment.
And it was entrapment. I mean, that is the right verdict, isn't it? It clearly was entrapment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole sting was built on the understanding that Hoffman had been approached by DeLorean, but in court it was proven that it was definitely the other way around. It was a clear-cut case of entrapment. Hoffman had posed as a representative for a mysterious cartel of investors, but as it became obvious in their conversations that it was a criminal organisation, DeLorean tried to back out. And at this point, Hoffman insinuated his daughter would be murdered if he backed out of the deal. And then at that secretly filmed meeting in a hotel room in LA, you can tell on the recording DeLorean was clearly suspicious, and the promissory note that he gave them as his investment in the drug smuggling scheme was worthless. It was later shown that he had signed it knowing that it was worthless. It was issued by a shell company that he had made up. However, he had accepted a suitcase containing 25 kilos of cocaine worth $24 million, and he was instantly arrested. Like, literally, they had a champagne toast, to our successful drug trafficking scheme, and the agents burst into the hotel room and arrested him.
Could I just do a line of this before you take me in?
Well, the thing is, it was entrapment, but it was entrapment because people like his neighbours and colleagues knew that he was a bit of a dodgy character who was prepared to do all sorts of things financially to ensure that his car would be produced. And that creative accountancy is, as we said, what brought brought him to the attention of Zale and Zemeckis and made him into the movie that actually made his car a star, albeit too late for the production of the actual vehicle, which had ceased by that point.
After his trial and obviously his subsequent acquittal, DeLorean joked, "Would you buy a used car from me?" But you can feel the pain that he must have been experiencing, because what he was imagining was the birth of a new GM kind of thing. And he had planned out not just this particular sports car, but a whole range of different vehicles, including everything right up to a bus. There was a DeLorean bus that was planned. So he really had this sort of grand scheme in mind that just didn't quite come off.
So in 1999, he declared bankruptcy and he was constantly being pursued over the collapse of the DeLorean Motor Company. But he continued to dream up new ideas for cars throughout the rest of his life. None of them really ever got off the ground. And it was the DeLorean that remained close to his heart. You know, when he died in 2005, there's a DeLorean on his gravestone, you know, the only model that never needs any repairs.